Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red. I'm joined by Nizar Hassan as always, and this week we have a very special guest with us. Rima Majed, an activist and professor of sociology at AUB, is with us to talk about the story that, of course, the only thing going on in Lebanon worth talking about, the protests, the uprising, and everything that is going on in the country. Rima, thanks so much for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your research and your work?
Thank you so much for having me. I am a professor at AUB, and for the past 10 years, I've been researching social movements and sectarianism, so it may be a bit useful for what is happening today. My research looks at the intersection between identity politics and social movements, and I've been teaching and researching this more specifically in the post-Taif Lebanon. So I look at protests since 1989.
And you're also heavily involved in organizing now during the uprising, right?
Right. It's just started, so we are, I'd rather say we're still trying to organize, although things have kicked off very quickly. We're trying to think of alternative ways of organizing, to think of what the system is and what does the regime mean and how does the regime work and how can we really work towards the downfall of this regime.
All right. That sounds super exciting. We will, I can't wait to dig into that in a little bit. But first, of course, we have just a few quick events that happened this week that we want to go through. The big thing, Hariri said, I'm no longer going to be a candidate for prime minister. Sort of, right? He himself is no longer a name, but he still controls the major Sunni bloc in parliament, which means he basically gets to decide who's next, or at very least he would probably need to greenlight whoever is next, unless other parties decided to go with a one-sided government. This week, the name that popped up, every week it seems like a new name pops up, or every few days a new name pops up for prime minister. This week it was Samir Khatib, who is an executive vice president and a partner at Khatib and Alami. And that's a very prominent contractor here in Lebanon and in the region. And he's not a politician, right? He's just like a business guy involved in contracting, which I think is a strange choice, personally, because if you're going for something that looks like anti-corruption government or clean government, you probably don't want contractors involved, right? Because that's sort of like the known to be the dirtiest industry. Not saying that he's corrupt or anything himself, but it just doesn't look good, right?
I mean, this is coming at the time of a revolution. I think the context is what makes it really weird, because Lebanon has a history of having businessmen and power. But I think what is, I would say, insulting to the streets is the fact that in the middle of an economic crisis where people are clearly saying, and I think even at the level of analysis, it's clear that we're saying there's a system of rentier, neoliberal economy that has governed post-war Lebanon that has failed, that is responsible for the crisis we are in today. And the solution is we get another ultra-rich person as head of the government.
From the one of the sectors that have been benefiting most from this economic model over the last 30 years.
I'm not an expert in the biography of neither Mr. Khatib nor Mr. Alami, but I think it's common knowledge that these names have been very close to power for a very long time. So this is really not a government that represents the demands of the streets.
They do, though, seem to have support politically, at least some level of support, including from Hezbollah. Also, a fun note that Nizar found, Wissam Ashur has been taking out ads on Facebook to support Khatib. Wissam Ashur, of course, another contractor. He's a developer, sort of notorious for the Eden Bay development on Beirut's coast, and also sort of famously the former son-in-law of Nabi Berri, the Speaker of Parliament. So yeah, like this guy is very connected within the political circles. It seems as though he has some sort of support, but that may not necessarily go so far because, as one Future Movement MP, Mohammed Hajjar, told the Daily Star this week, Prime Minister Hariri supports Samir Khatib, but supporting Khatib is one thing and nominating him for prime minister is another. Sort of signaling that, well, okay, the name Khatib is okay for now, but we don't really want him, it seems.
And another clear thing is that they are divided, which is good for us.
The political class itself.
The political class is divided, which is good for the uprising or the revolution. It's a political opportunity in social movements language. But this doesn't mean that their class interests will not be preserved. This regime, with all its internal divisions, is working towards protecting the interest of a class of the rich in this country. None of these names has said that they will do any clear step to save the economy. They are repeating yet and again, no haircuts, no capital control, which is a lie. There is haircut and capital control from our money. They are just protecting the rich. And I think this is the core of this revolution. And this is why whoever is named is not going to be accepted by the majority of people in the streets.
But I want to say something about Hariri as well, specifically. When he said that he doesn't want to be prime minister, he didn't only say that, it's going to be someone else. He said that it should be someone else and someone who takes into consideration what people are saying in the streets, especially women who have proven to have a lot of capacity in political leadership. He's basically saying, I want Raya Al-Hassan to be prime minister. Come on. It was so clear. And I think, to be honest, Samir Khatib's, floating Samir Khatib's name in this particular moment is one of two things. Either burning his card, as you say in Arabic, just making him another Safadi in this process, or an action by an opponent of Hariri in order to prevent Raya Al-Hassan government for some reason. Maybe Khatib is closer to his opponents than Raya Al-Hassan. Because the response of Muhammad Hajar that Ben just mentioned, supporting him is one thing and nominating him is another, is basically saying we have someone else in mind, and it's you don't impose a candidate on us just because he's close to our camp.
But Nizar, bad things happen.
Yeah.
Oh, that is an infamous quote from Raya Al-Hassan herself. Yeah. When what was it? When the protesters got beat, and she said sometimes bad things happen.
So the day that Hariri resigned, and when the tents in Riyadh Salah were broken and burnt, actually.
Not Raya Al-Hassan's most shining moment. Yeah.
She didn't have any shining moments. Let's be honest about this. She was in government and she had high expectations with her, being the first female interior minister, as if that's the biggest achievement. And then she didn't do anything.
It's a big achievement to have a woman as minister. It is,
but it's not
I think this is important. Especially in a country where women's representation and power is so
no, I'm not saying that's totally this to be dismissed, but I'm saying she's been in Hariri's political she's been a finance minister before. It's not like she's not part of the establishment. She's been working with Hariri or for Hariri for at least 10 years. She's basically just another person of the same class, she's been involved in the special economic zone in Tripoli, so the same economic paradigm that we're trying to fight against. So she's basically just another representative.
She's part of the establishment, definitely.
Yeah.
She strikes me sort of as an incrementalist, as in her heart may be in the right place and at least on certain issues or whatever, but she's not willing to just go against Hariri on anything. She's very much okay, well, we'll try to push the future movement in this direction, but ultimately I'm still loyal to the future movement, whatever they decide. Moving on, really quickly, parliamentary consultations to name a new prime minister were supposed to happen this week. Those got delayed. Kind of bizarrely, the excuse was that too many MPs were out of the country for the Independence Day holiday, which is really weird because Independence Day was a week prior to that. And do MPs leave the fucking country for Independence Day? That's just, I don't know. It doesn't make any sense, but that's what Bob was saying. And so this leaves us with 34 days as of Monday without a fully empowered government. Meanwhile, the economy is going to shit. The Lira hit 2,300 to the dollar this week. It's a little bit lower than that as we're recording this on Saturday, but it's expected probably to go back up to that level and get even worse. We heard this week that a bunch of restaurants, nightclubs, cafes, those kinds of establishments have been closing, 265 just in the past 2 months, according to the Syndicate of Owners. Also, gas stations went on strike on Thursday and Friday. This is one of those sort of weird things because it's the owners of gas stations that are doing this, and they're complaining about, we've covered this before about the exchange rate specifically. They get paid in Lira, but then they have to buy in dollars, and so they don't want to make up the difference. And so, but I'm a little bit unclear as to what the point of the strike action is, whether the point of the strike action is really to make this mechanism from BDL work that would allow them to exchange at the official exchange rate, or if they're really trying to just put pressure on the government to allow them to raise prices for everybody. I don't know. Certainly they want more money, though.
I'm not the best place to answer exactly what they're trying to do, but I think prices will increase in all cases because there's clearly an inflation. The question of the liquidity of the dollar is a serious question. We are a country that imports everything and exports almost nothing. We have always had a big service sector, but our economy is completely unproductive. The estimations are hinting at 100,000 people losing their jobs by the end of this year. So in the coming, in the last quarter of the year. This is a huge number for an economy that already doesn't open enough jobs, right? We are in an economy where we have, on average, yearly 32,000 new entrants to the market, but the market only opens in the good years 5,000 job opportunities. So we're talking about around 27,000 young Lebanese who either have to leave the country. They're literally born to be exported. This is probably the best thing we export. We're talking about the rest are either going into unemployment or the informal sector. So a very precarious life in this country for people who stay here. Government or policies that clearly push us to leave this country, go work abroad and send dollars because it's a dollarized economy. I think whether the central bank or the government is relying on is literally the remittances of Lebanese abroad, and now this is what they are really pushing for, right? And they want more people now to leave because they need even more money. So I think this is how they're perceiving things. So it's really protecting capital and not protecting society. There's no measures to protect the society.
Yeah, and we did see the politicians really did next to nothing all week long until Friday. Aoun shared this economic and financial meeting up in Baabda, right? But what came out of that meeting? Well, same old pretty much, right?
Yeah, they insisted that, no policy will be done either on the haircut or on capital controls. But they said that the banks, the central bank will basically ask banks to bring back $4 billion in capital that is invested abroad, $2 billion this year and $2 billion next year. And they asked the banks as well to raise the allowed dollar withdrawals because, as we said last week, the Association of Banks in Lebanon agreed on $1,000 per week as the limit for how many dollars you can withdraw from your own accounts. And BDL will be issuing circulars that regulates kind of how banks are treating clients in this sense, because there are major question marks surrounding what the banks are doing today and whether it's legal or not to basically prevent people from taking money from their current account rather than their deposit accounts. And then in the end, they talked about some regulation on exchange shops because many people are selling a lot of lira, trying to speculate or buying, etc., trying to speculate in large numbers, basically cracking down on that. And then one interesting note that the former economy minister or the economy minister in the caretaking government proposed something about a policy to organize remittances or to do something with remittances, and it was basically rejected, which is interesting because it's always been the case that Lebanon's policymakers have this, one of the red lines, one of the taboos, apart from capital controls, which has always been a taboo, is basically any formal or official action concerning the remittances. We get so many remittances, we rely on them for our economy, but they all go into private hands, they all go to families or into deposit accounts, etc., without the state taxing them or making any serious investment through this money. So this was rejected again. So what is clear from this meeting is basically nothing new will be done in terms of economic or financial policy, and they didn't reach a point yet where basically they have to do these difficult measures. They're still insisting that no, we're not going to do it.
Nizar, let me say that I think it's not exactly that nothing will be done. I think there is something that is being done. They are just protecting it, and they clearly said, I think the most important thing that came out of that meeting is the fact that they agreed that they will legally back Riyad Salemi in his proposed policies. So like they're covering him basically. And if we remember last week, when Riyad Salemi addressed us for the first time, because he usually only talks to on CNN to an international audience, when he decided to talk to us here, He told us, don't worry, I have dollars and I can lend it to the banks, but the interest is 20%. So practically what they are saying now is that, yes, we will tell banks to give you your money, but this will come with an interest of 20%, which means economically, I mean, this is accentuating the inflation. It means we will all lose our purchasing power, but it also means who's going to pay this 20%?
Taxpayers.
Not just taxpayers, it's depositors, and it's small, and it's us, basically. It's me, it's you, it's the average person who has a bank account. But
given that they said that they will not do any haircuts, so what they mean is basically it will be the state that will be carrying all the burden. But what I was trying to say is not that they will not do anything, is that they'll not do any of the policies that are necessary according to most economists to save the situation. They're basically postponing the same crisis.
I agree, but what I'm saying is that this 20% interest on dollars that Riyad Salemi mentioned quickly last time, I think is the main problem. It means that you can go withdraw $1,000, which is your $1,000, you will have to pay an extra $200 that the bank will charge you in different ways, extra charges on whatever, cards or direct charges, or I don't know how they're going to sort this out, but this will come out of our own money. So what he's solving the problem with an extra problem. And this has always been how the central bank has dealt with the financial issue in Lebanon. It's always out of our pockets, and it's always to protect the very rich depositors.
And really quickly here, just to tack onto that, the day before the meeting in Baabda, Lebanon did settle a $1.5 billion Eurobond payment, principal repayment. And the fact that they did that basically shows that, there aren't these sort of like out of the box thinking that's happening here. A lot of people would say, yes, Lebanon does need to do this. I don't think anybody was credibly saying that Lebanon couldn't do it at this point. But the question is whether you want to pay those dollars back and make your reserves that much smaller right now, or maybe just save those dollars, default now, save those dollars for these imports that you might need to pay for in the coming months. And no, it's stay the course. That was borne out on Thursday. Moving on, 2 people died this week when they hit a roadblock near Jiyeh early Monday morning. Hussein Shalhoub and Sana Al-Jindi. They were in a vehicle. They hit like this small metal fence type thing that was in the middle of the highway. The car skidded and then it crashed into a barrier and it lit on fire. And they weren't able to get out of the vehicle and they ended up dying. Of course, there was a big reaction to this. I mean, just the fact that this happened is a huge tragedy, and it inspired people to do vigils and everything. Some of those vigils that ended up happening like Monday night, this happened early Monday morning. So Monday night, we saw in Msharfiyeh, in Beirut southern suburbs, and in Nabatiyeh, they had like these candlelit vigils where people were saying that they were blaming the protesters because protesters have used roadblocks quite often as a tactic. And they were saying, hey, this means no more goddamn roadblocks because this is actually, killing people now. But as things sort of turned out, though, we've learned that it seems as though that roadblock was actually from the army.
It was basically just a point that the army was using to tell people to take the seaside road as opposed to the highway because the highway is blocked. So a few hundred meters before the roadblock by protesters, you have these little metal fences and a few army soldiers to tell you go right and take the seaside road. They did not crash into the protesters' roadblock. But it doesn't make a lot of difference. This was a big moment politically beyond what you said in terms of people like blaming protesters. Hezbollah released a statement. The Higher Islamic Shiite Council released a statement. Nabih Berri said things about it. It was made into this big moment, big sectarian strife moment, where basically the whole Shiite establishment rose up to say, like, this is an attack, and they called it an attack. They condemned the attack that led to the death of these people. It was not an attack, it was a car accident. And they used it to incite people against those blocking roads on the highway. And to give context, those blocking roads on the highway are Sunnis mostly from Iqlim al-Kharroub, which is one of the coastal areas in Shuf, that is close to the south. And there has been some tensions around this between basically mostly supporters of Amal and Hezbollah and those who have been blocking this road. And Berri said, made a metaphor that shows you how much they are investing in this moment. He said like the Israelis couldn't block the road to the south, so we shouldn't let anyone else block it. So it was really made into a big
I think this is
moment,
an unfortunate, it's unfortunate at two levels. Of course, I mean, a car accident and the death of is tragic in itself. Instead of this being an occasion to talk about how bad road safety is in Lebanon and how responsible this government is, they used this moment to sectarianize the movement. And it also came at the context of this is really that night clashes were happening on the ring, where protesters were facing the Shabiha or the thugs of, unfortunately, the two Shia sectarian parties who were chanting Shia, Shia and Iran, Iran. A clear attempt at sectarianizing the streets, at making it look as if there are two streets against each other. And these parties are experts at co-opting any movement. This is not new. As someone who studies the history of social movements in Lebanon, not only these two parties, most sectarian parties in Lebanon use this tactic, but co-optation is a clear tactic that they always use. And I think that this time they failed. Although the first 2 days there was a hype around it, I think by now the main priority in the country is back to the economic question. I don't think they succeeded this round to completely sectarianize.
And just very quickly to let everybody know what happened with that stuff. There were like several clashes that happened this week that you should know about. An incident in Bikfaya, which is like the ancestral home of the Jamail family. And FPM supporters were coming in a convoy trying to like pass through the town. And so, of course, Khatib supporters came out to prevent this. 10 people ended up being injured and 5 of them taken to the hospital. Also, we saw in Ain Romani clashes between the Lebanese forces and Hezbollah and Amal supporters. Watching this on TV was sort of like one of those, oh my God, this is crazy, because you're looking at Ain Romani and everybody is thinking the same thing, thinking about what happened back in 1975 in Ain Romani between Muslims and Christians that kicked off the civil war. And then you have these clashes that are going on, not at the same level, obviously, but something that one of these other like parallels that I think causes everybody to think twice.
Yeah, but Ben, I mean, I think your introduction is great because you've described the events for the past 2 minutes. You haven't mentioned the revolution at any point, right? This is clearly, and again, when we talk about attempts at sectarianization, this is how it happens, right? There are political parties, and this is a revolution that started in the streets saying, you are all equal. We refuse all of you. So even parties who have resigned and want to claim that they are part of the revolution, even parties who think of themselves as the opposition, and they are trying to drag us to this place where their clashes and their sectarianization of the moment will eventually kill the revolution. But again, I say they failed. And this is why we have to be very aware of what is happening. And I think the fact that this revolution is the result of the economic crisis and comes at a time where this is really the most pressing issue, I think is also playing on our side, because people don't have time now to think or to really, there is a bigger issue in the country today. All of this happened. We woke up the next morning, the dollar was 2,300 liras. People are saying, you know what, enough with you. We want a solution for the financial problem. And it's not a coincidence that all these the clashes and attempts at sectarianization are between partisans of political parties that are in power. Not just any political parties. And it's either an attack from those parties on the protesters or clashes between them. It's never any other type of violence. And I'm saying this to say that the fear of sliding into a civil war, I think this is a concept that is completely wrong. We never slide into a civil war. Civil wars are political decisions. It is a decision that has to be taken. If the decision is taken, they will do it. They will find the arms for it. They will take the decision based on what they can or they can't do. But this is clearly not a decision that the revolution can take. The only sides responsible for any violence in the streets is the political parties that are or were in power since the Taif agreement.
Yeah, and the one clashes that did involve the protesters, the ones on Sunday night in downtown. You mentioned them briefly earlier. That was
an attack. That was not really clashes.
Well, there was some sort of incident that happened, and then like there's a video of somebody getting on a phone saying, "Get them all down here quickly, quickly, quickly," and then a bunch of guys, obviously supportive of the Amal movement and Hezbollah, showed up shortly thereafter, and then we saw the first like smashing up and violence in downtown since October 29th. This is the story that is being
circulated, but I bet to differ. Even the initial clash that took place, I think, was orchestrated. Because this was not just a reaction to a little clash that happened here. It was orchestrated because this happened in Sur, in Tyre, in Baalbek, in Beirut. So it happened the same night in different places. So this is not just a spontaneous reaction. This is an orchestrated attack. And I think we have to put it as such. We have to be very clear in what we're talking about. These are political parties that are playing the sectarian card. They're playing their militia card, actually. They're trying to tell us that, look, we can do this if we want. And I think people have responded spontaneously in a very, the peacefulness exceeds any expectation. I think in any other context, we would have seen way more violence. And I think at that point, it would be maybe violence that can be understood. I mean, I'm still, every time things like this happen, I'm really surprised, positively surprised at how peaceful things are. And really how the capacity of this revolution to contain the constituencies of those parties.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of points to make about this specific scene, the one on the ring bridge between protesters and the Amal and Hezbollah supporters. First of all, as you're saying, it was an attack. We have many testimonies from protesters that actually the one who basically was calling these people to come down was the one who had this mission of just like creating this in the first place. And there are many, many descriptions of how he did that and how explicit and obvious that was. That the whole thing was orchestrated. That is the other thing is that, you know, these protesters these basically shabiha, as we say in Arabic, from Hezbollah and Amal, what they were doing is basically throwing stones at people and hitting the army, hitting the journalists, etc. for a period of many hours, and the army or police had no official decision, it seems, to basically stop them from doing that. They were being too nice with them, especially given that they have been too harsh with the protesters before, using tear gas quite randomly, like in an arbitrary manner and very, very aggressive manner against protesters, especially in the first few days of the revolution in Riyadh Sulah. And it was only after this escalated and took so long that the army took the decision to throw tear gas, and they threw it both ways. They threw it at the protesters and at the thugs. So we're talking about situation, thugs meaning people who are attacking protesters rather than anything with a class dimension. So we're talking about a situation where basically there was no political will in the beginning because it was sending a political message, and the security forces are in this situation where they need a political decision to take any action against such an attack. And when you talk about Sur, as you did, where Hezbollah and Amal supporters went and burnt the tents of protesters in their main camp, in their main protest camp there, this was not about a road being blocked. This was not about anything like that, because the excuse is always that the ring is being blocked. This is why they're coming to attack it. It has nothing to do with that. In Baalbek, we had things as well. Hezbollah supporters and surrounding people and protesters and basically putting them in the situation where they're stuck in one building, using arms. So it was a crackdown by this side of the political spectrum. It's playing this role, this specific counter-revolution role, while the other side was using these same incidents.
If I can just make a sociological observation on the margin of what you're saying, I think another important, of course I agree, I mean there are all these layers, a political layer, etc. But I think also just visually looking at that scene on the ring, there's something that sociologically jumps to the eye. There was one side that was exclusively men dressed in black. There was another side that was more diverse in terms of gender, age, etc. And I'm saying this to say that violence is also, and I think it's important to mention that it's also about toxic masculinities. And this is not a detail in understanding why these people are behaving the way they behave sometimes. I mean, the excess and the feeling of masculinity that was so clearly displayed in their chants and their I think is also, and this is why when we say the problem, I mean, we need to think more intersectionally, if you want. This is a system that is not only a neoliberal inequality, class-based divisions. It's not only sectarian. It's all, there's overlap between all of these things, and it's also clearly a patriarchal system in which toxic masculinity is at the core of those clashes and how they happen.
You bring up something that I think is really, really interesting with this, and that is that these people who came out and were clashing with protesters, to my eye, they remind me a lot more of what the protesters looked like the first two or three nights. So there's like this, there's a gender side of this, and there's a class side of this that hasn't been fully explored.
That were present at the beginning. What was absent was the sectarian aspect to this, and the image we saw 42 or 43 days. So the image at the ring, almost a month later, was an image where the parties were making sure they reintroduced the sectarian aspect. You're right to say that the image looks actually similar to the beginning of the revolution, except that if you put it on mute, you probably wouldn't tell the difference. If you hear the slogans, it's very different. And there's clearly a transformation that happened throughout the past 45 days in terms of class dynamics. And also, of course, complex, as I said. It's not just class dynamics, but it's, I think, mainly class dynamics. The revolution started in Beirut with the deprived classes, many of them constituencies of those parties. And the streets really exploded with them initially, mobilizing in the streets and saying, we've had enough with all of you, including their own parties. And that was the image for the first 2 days. And this is why I would call it like a revolution, because I think there's a deep shift that happened at the social level in those 2-3 days at the beginning that were unprecedented. Now, how things developed in the squares, how it spread to other regions, and every region has its own characteristics and its own, we can go into the details of the different class dynamics. But I think specifically in Beirut, what happened is that the first few days, the motorbikes were everywhere in Riyadh Sulh. You remember? I mean, we were walking, and there was a kind of a very spontaneous and quick alliance between the middle classes and the working classes and the unemployed and the poor to mobilize together. On the third day, the transformations in the square with some parties and some groups bringing their tents, their big stages, the big speakers, the
Sabah movement, for instance.
The Sabah, for instance, and some other groups, and the speakers where everyone became forced to listen to the same songs and to the same discourse, and I think has alienated a lot of people, and in terms of class dynamics has made a lot of people feel that that this is not exactly what they want. It doesn't look like them. It doesn't look like their demands. It doesn't look like their, the beginning of their revolution. I'm not trying to say that we are responsible for having mobilized the way we have, but I'm just saying that this is the structure of this. I mean, the class structure of the society and how it unfolds, and who are the pre-existing organizations that were already there. I mean, the fact that there's no organization for the unemployed in Lebanon, for example, the fact that interest-based and class-based organizations are absent. So there's no real container for those, for the initial mobilizations to stay in the square. And the square quickly transformed to, the usual activists, the usual groups that are there. Some new groups like us have emerged. But we have lost part of this alliance between the different classes, and now it's probably more middle classes.
I would like to make a comment about this because I have slightly different observations. I agree with part of what you said about the different use of the space and the groups, the pre-established groups coming with their resources, especially the ones with a lot of money and the stages, etc. But this was not what brought like the young men who were burning things and breaking the windows out of the streets, in my opinion. I think what happened is, on the third day, the riot police installed barbed wires and fences between them and the protesters. This was not on the first 2 days. So the confrontation was over. You could not reach the policemen anymore. People who were excited about this conflict, about this physical aspect of it, were alienated by this. Second, on the same day, you had human chains formed, 3 lines of women forming a human chain, 3 human chains, right? But just to make it thick and resilient, between the protesters and the police force, although there were barbed wires and fences. So I was having like a quite deep conversation with many of the guys who were coming in the beginning and were not and stopped coming later, and they told me that one of the main reasons is that the nature of the protest or the mode of protest does not match what they were excited about in the beginning, which seemed more real and more serious. And this is not to say that, you know, it's to, instead of to blame the groups, I'm blaming the women who did the human chains or whatever. But I'm saying there are many things that happen at the same time. So the women who are doing the human chains were doing it for a very, very, very good reason, which is the first 2 days, everyone was paying the price of a few people creating clashes with the police. And if we were there at the anyone who was in Riyadh Sulh noticed that 1 or 2 incidents or a few incidents accumulating led the police to basically throw tear gas on everyone, and, you know, thousands of people suffocating. This was not fair, and a lot of people had to take action about this, and this is why they did the human chains. Things were making sense, where people were doing what made sense. But what I'm saying is there are many things by the police by installing these wires and ending this confrontation with the police force that existed in the first 2 days, and with the people taking this taking the action of the human chains, and with the groups that were establishing their tents and their big stages, etc. All of these things. But still, in my view, the first week, because I really didn't leave the street any moment in the first 10 days, it was still the working class who were just basically dominant in the city. But it was just a different section of the same working class and doing different things. You saw all of the small merchants coming with their carts, right, selling food, etc. You saw people coming with their ergile, etc. You had like this explosion of working class culture in the base, in the middle, in the heart of downtown, which is the most anti-working class space ever. It was just not about the same mode of protest that was happening in the beginning.
Yeah,
so it was not purely like the working class leaving and the middle class taking over, but rather a slow dynamic. And the political aspect of this...
I mean, we can go into a debate about how do we define the working class and the middle class, and this is why I say classes. And I mean, we can go into this. Yes, of course. I'm not trying to say that but I'm talking about a very specific group that mobilized at the beginning on motorbikes that are mainly the constituencies of, traditionally the constituencies of sectarian political parties and the transformation. And I didn't finish my initial idea because I was asked about the class aspect specifically. One aspect I'm saying is the mode of protest and how and who took over in the squares. And this is because of organization. This is because of the pre-existing organization and the fact that there are no organizations, and which leads us to why we are trying to work on unions and reviving the idea of organizing based on class interest. But the second thing is that this is not just a reaction to what was happening just in the squares, because political parties were also working their usual card of clientelism outside the squares, and clientelism not just in terms of, it's not always just positive, incentives. It can also be threats and negative incentives in terms of security, in terms of not paying, not supporting, taking away the wasta, whatever. Especially because I also did interviews the first week with a lot of people in the squares and outside the squares. And a lot of these people were saying that the legal card that parties play against them is one of the main ways they co-opt them, if you want. There was also the fact that we were coming to closer to the end of the month. People had bills to pay. So there were many layers that led to this, and it's complex. But I think we cannot completely overlook the transformations in the class dynamics in the squares, and how political parties have played on this outside the squares to bring back a lot of those young men who mobilized at the beginning against them, either to become silent or to mobilize against us in the squares.
Yeah, and it was so fascinating, the first attack that happened against the Ring protesters, the first major one, that so many of the protesters were basically saying exactly the same words on TV, which is, we are the ones who are poor and we were the ones who were protesting in the beginning, but now they are blocking, these like more privileged people are blocking the roads against us, etc. And it was clearly, it was this class dimension that was so powerful, like to hear at the same time. It was and I know a lot of these people, and they are organized, like people who were in the streets, many of them are organized in political parties. So it was a message that was, I think, intelligently disseminated by these political parties to these protesters, because this is the best thing you can say. If you're attacking protesters, you have no basically good excuse, except if you play on some of these dynamics, class dynamics. But as you were saying, to go back to what you're saying about organization, like it's basically this moment that we realize how much we lack organizations that move people on class interests rather than
sectarian. I mean, one of the main predicaments and one of my main fears for this revolution is the question of organization. I mean, we have almost a fetish with the idea of non-organization, with being against political parties, because political parties are in this context so linked with corruption. Like, they have such a negative connotation that we grew to refuse them, but I think it's important for us to imagine alternatives, and alternatives that are based on organization, because non-organization will only feed into reproducing the same system. So what I was saying at the beginning, diagnosing what the problem is important. So when the people say they want the downfall of the regime, what is this regime that we want to topple? And I think this is a regime that mainly, not just in Lebanon, it's not a coincidence that revolutions or uprisings are erupting almost everywhere in the world, from Chile to Bolivia to Georgia to Bosnia to everywhere. It's a crisis of an economic system that governs today, that is called neoliberalism. If you don't like the term, you can call it whatever you want. It's this economic system that has really made the concentrated wealth in the hands of a few. So this is a system in Lebanon. Clearly, when we talk about the regime, we are talking about the post-war neoliberal regime and what it has done to state institutions. Not that it was great before the war, but I think it worsened after the war. And then, of course, the other aspect of this regime is the sectarian regime. So we are really tiptoeing in a minefield that is very complicated. But I think it's important for us to say this in order for us to be able to think of possible solutions, right? Or possible ways to push forward. So this is a system that, as long as we behave or act or mobilize as individuals, we will never threaten them. And they know this. This is why they're very happy. Lebanon has a big civil society, and by civil society, I mean NGOs more than anything else, because civil society can be a good term. As many NGOs as you want, as long as you adopt the ideology of the system, which is a liberal, it's highly individualized, there's no threat on the regime. This is a regime that has, the first thing it attacked after the civil war and systematically destroyed are the unions. Any kind of organization that is not sectarian and that is not based on the idea of the individual interest is something that threatens this regime. And this is why what we're proposing is that let's seriously threaten this regime then by starting to organize ourselves collectively to defend our collective interest. This is a regime, if you remember when Rafiq al-Hariri gave his first speech, when he gave himself an ultimatum of 72 hours, and then when he came back and with his plan... You mean
Saad al-Hariri?
Saad al-Hariri, sorry.
Because I went back to 92 and I was like, what's happening?
That's a Freudian slip. It's an extension of that, talking about neoliberalism, right? But when he proposed his plan 72 hours later, if you remember, he also had a Freudian slip, and he said, this might not be what people in the streets want, but this is what I want. So he's clearly saying, I'm defending my interest and the interest of my class. And I think we should work exactly the same way. We should organize based on our interest and tell them, these are our interests. We organized, and because there's no leadership for this movement in the sense that this is not a coup, this is not a pre-organized revolution.
There's no vanguard party.
So there's no vanguard party. There's no. We are working in very different conditions. So definitely, no one can speak in the name of the 1.5 million or 2 million in the street, but we can surely speak in the name of our. Where we are in this society, our professions. We can speak in the name of our social position that is based on our class or interest to really tilt the vertical sectarian divide to a horizontal interest-based divide where we mobilize based and we organize based on our interest, not based on our sects or identity or vertical identities. And we push against a regime that is clearly telling us that they are defending their own class interest, from Riyad Salemi, from the central bank to the prime minister to the president of the republic,
to the future prime minister,
to the future prime minister. They are all saying the same thing. They are all saying we are here to protect the rich. We don't really care what happens to the rest. You can eat. As Marie Antoinette said, you can eat brioche.
So what are you doing in terms of organizing? Just give us very briefly, because we have to wrap up. What are you involved in? Because there's this association.
So we have started with at the beginning there were many different groups apparently thinking about in the same direction, and this really came from the experience of Sudan. And because I teach social movements, and I was teaching a course last year on the revolutions, the only two revolutions in the region that were able to have a sort of transition that is acceptable are Tunisia and Sudan. And in both cases, the reason and the key player was, in Tunisia was the pre-existence of a strong, the unions were really strong. In Sudan, it was the professionals association. So we thought that, in Lebanon, now that the revolution has started, we lack. We always realize how badly we lack these pre-existing organizations. So we thought that, and it's very difficult. This is why I previously said we're trying. This is an attempt at organizing. We thought that it's important for us to start building this kind of organization. So we started with the Association of University Professors. Very quickly, it started very randomly and spontaneously. I put on Facebook, me and another colleague of mine from the Lebanese University, we put a call for university professors who are interested to meet us under the egg at 7 p.m. on the same day. We got there, the turnout was so big. I screamed my phone number and we started creating WhatsApp groups. We have more than 700 professors who joined those groups, and then we had to think of alternative ways of organizing. So now we have different associations in different universities. We are still in the process of thinking of how do we organize, how do we take decisions, etc. But there's clearly a need, and we are there's such a demand for this. Now, of course, the devil lies in the details of how you organize and how you move forward. But this was an idea that I think was successful in that it was able to speak to a really big section of the society, and people who said, yes, I want to identify as my profession, as my position in this society, not as a sect or etc. Then this same experience was taking place with other professions. So we all came together. So some medical doctors, some lawyers, some journalists, some workers in the NGO sectors. We all came, and some architects and engineers. We came together and we created a bigger umbrella of professionals association. In Arabic, it's called تجمع مهنيات ومهنيين. And we are, again, still in the process of trying to organize and find a structure for ourselves. But the vision is that we want to work on the base, we want to work on the horizontal divisions and on organizing ourselves in this way, because we believe that the only way to really fight this regime is from below. We can politically, we can work on, from above. We can propose, we can push for what we want from the government, what we want. But in the everyday, this is a regime that fought us in our unions, that prevented us from organizing collectively, that made sure we remain individuals. And here, if you allow me, and this I think there are great initiatives that have emerged in the past, specifically after 2015. I was part of many of them. A lot of them are my friends, and I completely support them and respect their work, and I think they're doing great efforts. But I just want to highlight what the liberal system means in terms of even us activists. I mean, it's not completely random that most of the very successful and great movements that came out of the 2015 youth thing are all movements that insist on the individual right rather than the collective right. And if you look at the names, it's either Madinati, Naqabati, Haqqi. It's all about the individual. It's never
my right, my city,
right, my city, my union. It's not our. It's not Madinatuna, Haqquna, Naqabatuna, etc. I'm just mentioning a few points. And again, I mean, these are great initiatives and I fully support them. But I'm just saying this is the ideology behind, and this is something we have to maybe think about and be careful when we organize, because I think this plays completely in the field of what this regime, if we diagnose it as a neoliberal regime and a sectarian one, then we are completely playing within their rules. And maybe it's also time for us to start thinking of how do we completely smash it, not just, play within it.
And I think right there, like that's the note to end it on. Unfortunately, until part 2, hopefully, sometime in the future. That's it for us this week. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for
Rima.
having me.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And we'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, I'm Benjamin Red.
I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Rima Majed.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast.
The Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.